Is the way asylum cases are handled in the United States about to change forever? There's a new form of asylum interview that you need to know about, and it's very different from the current process for certain asylum seekers. I'm going to tell you in this video everything you need to know about this new type of asylum interview called the Asylum Merits Interview. Stick with me to the end because I need to tell you who is being subjected to this new asylum application process. I'm Brian Mannigan. I used to be an asylum officer with the government, but now, as an asylum lawyer, I help immigrants all over the country secure their future in America through asylum. So what is this Asylum Merits Interview? Well, it's a special kind of interview that's being done for certain asylum seekers as part of an attempt to speed up processing of asylum claims. Right now, when someone comes to the US border or to a US airport and asks for asylum, their case may well take years to finish. They have to go through several steps, usually with both USCIS, the agency that handles affirmative asylum claims, and the immigration court. In immigration court, they're part of the mass of 1.6 million people in deportation proceedings. And with so many people in the system and limited resources, it can take a really long time for the person's hearings to conclude. The Asylum Merits Interview process aims to change this, to make things hopefully go quicker by allowing asylum officers to grant asylum in certain cases where, in the past, only a judge could do so. The idea is that the asylum office should be able to more quickly adjudicate these claims than the immigration court. And for cases that do end up in immigration court, new rules are in place to try to push these cases through the system much more quickly. The rules take particular asylum claims and give them priority for processing, sort of taking them out of the queue of 1.6 million people who are waiting for a court hearing. The goal of speeding up asylum cases is admirable, but there are some serious questions about whether this program may disadvantage asylum seekers. That's the overview. Let's dig into the details. When someone comes to the United States without a visa, including folks seeking asylum at the southern border, or if they come to the airport with a visa and say they want to seek asylum, well, they're placed into what are called expedited removal proceedings. This can lead to a person being deported almost immediately unless they express to US immigration officials a fear of being harmed in their own country, or if they say they want to seek asylum. And when they do that, they're usually scheduled for what's called a credible fear interview with an asylum officer who works for USCIS. And this credible fear interview may take place while the person's detained by immigration authorities, or if they've already been released, then the credible fear interview is done at a USCIS asylum office near where the person's living in the United States. And if the asylum officer thinks the person has at least some shot of winning asylum or another similar form of protection, they issue a positive credible fear determination. Now, to be clear, this is not the same as actually granting the person asylum or the right to stay in the United States. Rather, the credible fear interview is considered a threshold screening, which is basically for the purpose of assessing whether the applicant would have at least a realistic chance of winning asylum were they permitted to really explain their case in full. And that doesn't happen at a credible fear interview, which is a short, perfunctory screening where the officer pretty much gets the basics of the claim but doesn't really dig too deeply into it. Where a person receives a negative credible fear determination, they could end up being deported very soon, sometimes as soon as days. Traditionally, when someone gets a positive determination, they get put into immigration court proceedings where they'll go on to apply for asylum by submitting the asylum application form, and then they present their case to an immigration judge. But that takes a long time, usually years. And this is where the new Asylum Merits Interview comes in. New rules give USCIS the option to take cases where a positive credible fear determination has been made and to keep them with the asylum office for further processing rather than sending them over to the immigration court. Now, where a person gets a positive credible fear determination, instead of being placed in proceedings before an immigration judge, they may be scheduled for an Asylum Merits Interview before an asylum officer. So what exactly is an Asylum Merits Interview? Well, it's similar to a traditional interview that the asylum office does for people who are not in deportation proceedings, in the sense that an officer asks you a bunch of questions and then decides whether you're eligible for asylum. This takes place in person at an asylum office, and the interview will likely last a few hours, and you can submit evidence in support of your case, and you can have a lawyer present with you. But it's different than a normal asylum interview because at a normal asylum interview, the officer can only give you asylum. They can't give you any other forms of protection. But in the context of an asylum merits interview, in addition to considering your asylum eligibility, the officer is also assessing whether you may qualify for a couple other forms of protection. These are called withholding of removal and protection under the United Nations Convention Against Torture. And they're similar to asylum in that you qualify based on danger you may face in your country. But they don't come with the same benefits as asylum. So they're not as good as asylum, but they do allow you to stay in the United States and to work legally. And you might qualify for one of these forms of protection despite not being eligible for asylum. So an asylum merits interview is likely to be longer and more thorough than a traditional asylum interview because the officer has to consider these forms of humanitarian protection in addition to the asylum analysis. So what happens after an asylum merits interview? Well, before I tell you about that, listen, if you want to maximize your chances for asylum success, then be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell notification so that you don't miss the insights that I share on this channel. Okay, so here's what happens after the asylum merits interview. If the officer decides you're eligible for asylum, and that's it, it's final, you win asylum. And this is the scenario that can be really beneficial to both the government and the asylum seeker because it means you'll have gotten through the process in a fraction of the time it would have taken for your case to run its course in immigration court. But if the officer concludes that you're not eligible for asylum, then your case gets sent to immigration court. And this is true even if the officer decides that you do qualify for withholding of removal or protection under the Convention Against Torture. To be clear, if the decision is negative with regard to asylum, then your case is transferred to immigration court. And there, you can expect to have 2 or perhaps 3 different hearings before an immigration judge. The first hearing is called a master calendar hearing or a preliminary hearing, at which the judge will explain what your rights are and tell you what's going to happen in your court proceedings. You do not have to be ready to explain your asylum case at this point. Rather, this hearing is pretty much administrative in nature. It's quick and easy. Next, you'll have a court hearing called a status conference. In this hearing, or conference, you'll tell the judge whether you want to testify at a third hearing called a merits hearing, and you'll also identify any witnesses that you plan to ask to testify on your behalf at that merits hearing. And at the status conference, you can also point out any errors in the record that was created of what happened during your asylum merits interview, and you can make certain other designations. This is still not the hearing at which you fully explain your case, but important things do go on at the status conference, so you really should have a lawyer represent you for it. The immigration judge is allowed to make a decision after the status conference if they think they've seen and heard enough from the record produced as part of your asylum merits interview and from your 2 hearings up to this point in immigration court. But if you insist at your status conference on presenting your case, then the judge will likely schedule 1 more hearing called a merits hearing where you can do that. And that hearing, the merits hearing, will be basically the same as a merits hearing, sometimes referred to as an individual hearing, in a normal deportation case. And by normal, I mean a case that has not reached the court through the asylum merits interview process. At the merits hearing, your lawyer will ask you questions, and with your answers, you're addressing all the aspects required to show the judge that you're eligible for asylum. But the lawyer for ICE will ask you questions to try to show the judge that you should not win asylum. And the judge can ask you questions directly too. The judge will normally make a decision on the day of the merits hearing after the testimony concludes. Sometimes though, they need more time and will mail the decision later. If you get a negative decision from the judge, resulting in an order of deportation, you can appeal it within 30 days to an entity called the Board of Immigration Appeals. All right, in summary, the steps are: positive determination after credible fear interview may lead to an asylum merits interview. If you don't win asylum at that stage, you'll get a chance to explain your case to a judge in immigration court, where you'll have 2 or 3 hearings called a master calendar hearing, a status conference, and a merits hearing, with a decision coming at the end of or shortly after that merits hearing. Now, how is this any different from cases that don't get put into the asylum merits interview process? Because you see, normally if you get a positive credible fear determination, you go to immigration court where you have a master calendar hearing and a merits hearing, and the judge decides your fate. Fairly similar to the asylum merits interview path, right? Well, the main difference is with the fact that you can win asylum through the asylum merits interview process from the asylum office without ever having to go into the immigration court process. Also, the timeline for cases that do end up in immigration court is very different. Despite the asylum merits interview process adding 2 steps that don't exist under the normal credible fear procedures in the form of the asylum merits interview and the status conference, it should still go much faster, thanks to the timelines built into the rules. Remember how I said the normal court process for getting asylum normally takes years? Well, compare that with this timeline for the asylum merits interview process, which I don't imagine the government will follow perfectly, but which should still help to move things along fairly quickly. The asylum merits interview is supposed to occur between 21 and 45 days after you receive the positive credible fear determination. Then, if you don't win asylum at that stage, the master calendar hearing in court is supposed to happen 30 to 35 days after the negative decision from the asylum merits interview is issued. Next, the status conference should happen 30 to 35 days after the master calendar hearing. The merits hearing is supposed to occur 30 days after the status conference, but not more than 65 days from the time of the master calendar hearing, which is the step preceding the status conference. Where the judge doesn't issue their decision at the merits hearing, they're supposed to make one within 45 days of that hearing. So in total, from the time of the credible fear decision, we're looking at a timeline that should lead to a decision by an immigration judge in not more than 145 days. Now, that may sound like a lot, but it's nothing compared to what most asylum cases take in immigration court. And that's also the outer limit. There's a chance you'll get a decision sooner than that. There's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding this asylum merits interview process because it's so new. The government just started doing these cases in the summer of 2022, and they haven't actually done very many. They're starting slow, putting only a few hundred people who receive positive credible fear determinations into this program each month. I'll update you as we learn more about how this program is being applied, but for now, I just want to flag 3 more details. 1, you do not need to file an asylum application form if you're given an asylum merits interview. I know, this sounds weird. You're seeking asylum, but you don't need to file for asylum, but that's how it works. The asylum officer's notes from the credible fear interview are considered to be the equivalent of an asylum application form, and you're considered to have applied for asylum for purposes of the 1-year filing deadline on the date that you receive the positive credible fear decision. 2, you can include your spouse and unmarried children who are under 21 years of age in your asylum merits interview process, but only if they were included in the positive credible fear determination or they too have their own separate asylum interview merits process underway. 3, not everyone who gets a positive credible fear decision will have an asylum merits interview. The government's goal is to eventually have pretty much everyone go down this path, but they're rolling this program out slowly. At present, it's only for people at certain detention facilities who have indicated that they will resettle in the United States in one of 7 cities where the staff at the immigration courts are receiving specialized training to implement this program. If you're ready to take the next step and get individualized help with your asylum case, then call my office today. It's 713-909-0401. And remember, we help people all over the country, so it doesn't matter where you are. Call us now to schedule an asylum strategy session so we can help you secure your future in America through asylum. Again, I'm Brian Manning, and it's an honor to serve you in your asylum journey.